good public servant she is. Gabby, we know you'll be back, but until then, we wish you and Mark all the very best, and we thank you for your extraordinary service to our nation. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I addressed the Senate recently on President Obama's recess appointments, and he did this when the Senate was not, in fact, in recess. I described at length why this was an outrageous and unconstitutional power grab. However, President Obama's decision to bypass the constitutional advice and consent of the Senate is not an isolated incident by the President. It is merely the latest escalation in a pattern of contempt for elected representatives of the American people and the constitutional separation of power. This pattern has become more apparent since the last election, when public opinion turned against the direction that President Obama was trying to take the country. When the President's 2009-2010, when the President party in 2009 and 2010 had an overwhelming control of both houses of Congress, he was able to pursue his agenda with only the slightest of lip service to the objections from congressional Republicans, because we were very much in the minority. And, of course, we feel representing millions of Americans whose views were represented by people in opposition to President Obama's views. In 2009 and 2010, President Obama could, in fact, govern more like a prime minister in a European parliament, where the leader of the party in power dictates the policy to be rubber-stamped by that parliament. Now, since the 2010 election, that's no longer the case. There was a tremendous voter backlash against both the style and substance of the President's agenda. The groundswell of Americans became convinced that their government was out of touch, and they demanded to be heard. The President's party in the Senate is now well below the supermajority necessary to pass legislation without consulting the minority party, and that's the way it was intended for the Senate to work. Moreover, there is now a new majority in the House of Representatives trying to chart a new course based on the concerns that so many voters expressed in the last election. Rather than accept the message of the 2010 election and faced with a Congress that is no longer a rubber stamp, the President has decided that he doesn't need Congress at all. Now imagine that. In fact, he's even said so. In October, Upset that Congress would not pass his latest stimulus bill exactly as he proposed, the President launched a media campaign around the tagline, quote unquote, "We can't wait for Congress." Under this banner, he has announced executive actions for everything from mortgage and student loans, summer jobs for youth, and new fuel economy standards. A president being frustrated with Congress is nothing new. We all know that from history. What's more remarkable is the notion that the president, however, can act independently of Congress. Where they won't act, I will, the president has said. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution of the United States says, quote, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives." End of the quote. Having had their rights violated by King George, our founding fathers intentionally put the power to make laws in the branch of government that is most directly related and accountable to the citizenry of this country. Under our Constitution, the President's role is not to make policy unilaterally, but to quote the Constitution, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Some might say that the whole "we can't wait" campaign is just harmless political rhetoric. It would be bad enough if the President were just kidding when he implies that he is usurping legislative power. The legislative power is vested in the duly elected representatives of the citizens of our 50 states. However, after his latest power grab, there can be no doubt that President Obama is dead serious. It's not just political rhetoric. This disregard for the constitutional role of Congress didn't start with President Obama's quote, unquote, "we can't wait for Congress" campaign. An earlier indicator of actions to come was his controversial appointment of several new so-called czars. The President is well within his rights to choose advisors. We all agree to that, which is what these positions now termed czars were supposed to be, just as advisors. However, it became clear that many of President Obama's new high-level czars, like the climate czar, for instance, were involved in crafting regulations and other roles normally reserved for Senate-confirmed officials. Why? Because then they could be called to the Senate committees to respond and have us operate a proper oversight function. Another example of President Obama's disregard for Congress is his administration's unilateral pursuit of climate change regulations. The House and Senate have considered various proposals to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but these have proved very controversial and very harmful to the economy. When the climate legislation backed by President Obama could not achieve sufficient support to pass Congress, the administration announced that it would go ahead anyway. While a Supreme Court ruling opened the door to that possibility, the fact that Congress specifically did not authorize such regulations should have given the President pause. In a similar move, when the DREAM Act, as currently written, was unable to secure sufficient support in Congress to pass, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement Memorandum appeared calling for immigration laws to be enforced so as to bring about the same ends as the legislation that couldn't pass Congress. Congress also rejected the card check bill supported by President Obama to eliminate secret ballot elections for union members. Sure enough, the National Labor Relations Board proposed a rule providing for snap elections, which would achieve the same goals of thus giving union leaders an upper hand in union elections. The President's Race to the Top education program is another significant overreach. Congress bears responsibility for writing a $5 billion check to the Secretary of Education in the first stimulus bill with minimal guidelines attached. However, the administration blew past even those broad guidelines to implement an unprecedented federal intervention into state education policy. The resulting program offered the possibility of big grants to cash-strapped states, provided they first changed state laws to implement specific policies favored by the Secretary of Education. Most states, like Iowa, implemented the Secretary's preferred policies and applied for the funds, yet never saw a dime in return for changing our state laws. In a similar move, the President announced that he would grant waivers to states for relief from the requirements of No Child Left Behind. The catch is that states will have to adopt key components of his education reform agenda in order to get such a waiver. This is despite the fact that Congress is currently considering legislation to update the federal education policy and may not adopt all aspects of the President's proposal. Moreover, current law allows for waiving existing requirements on a case-by-case basis, but does not authorize the administration to add new requirements in return. So far, during my remarks, I've mostly focused on areas where the President has acted without authority from Congress. On the other hand, when Congress has passed legislation the President doesn't entirely agree with, he has announced, while signing them into law, that he won't implement the parts that he doesn't like. During the 2008 campaign,
Senator's time has expired.
I thought we had until 1 o'clock. Is that right or wrong?
Senators have up to 10 minutes.
Could I ask for the time up until the time the Republican time is up at 1 o'clock?
I don't. There's no order about the time. Is there objection to Senator speaking to 1 p.m.?
You're right, Mr. Chairman. Just to ask how many more minutes. I am going to speak for just a few minutes before the 1 o'clock starts.
Let me defer to my colleagues. I will not pursue it anymore. I'll put the rest of my statement in the record.
Without objection.
Very much appreciate my friend from
Senator from
Iowa.
Michigan is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the courtesy. I know that there are a number of colleagues that will be speaking at 1, and I appreciate having the opportunity to say a few words prior to that. Mr. President, I rise today to congratulate my state of Michigan on its 175th anniversary of statehood. On Thursday, January 26, 1837, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the bill granting Michigan statehood. The bill was surprisingly controversial. At the time, Michigan and Ohio had been embroiled in an argument called the Toledo War. Before Michigan was granted statehood, it had to surrender its claim over Toledo, but in exchange, we got the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, one of the most beautiful places in the entire country, I would say in the entire world. So, Mr. President, I think we won that trade. 24 years later, President Lincoln would exclaim, "Thank God for Michigan," when Michigan troops arrived to defend Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. Around the turn of the century, the auto industry took off in Michigan. Henry Ford paid the workers $5 a day to build the Model Ts so that they could afford to buy the cars that they made. That was viewed as revolutionary at the time. Those workers not only created the middle class in this country, and we are very proud that it started in Michigan with our workers, but they made America an international superpower. During World War I, Michigan factories built boats and vehicles that helped turn the tide in Europe. During World War II, Michigan's role became even more important. Auto plants were rapidly converted to military use, building tanks and jeeps and bombers. The nation's first freeways were built in Michigan to connect our factories in Detroit with those in other parts of the state. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter saying, "We can do it," was based on a real woman named Rose Monroe, who worked at the Willow Run factory in Michigan. After the war, Michigan experienced incredible growth, becoming the home of our American middle class. Only California and Florida saw greater population growth than Michigan in the post-war years. Manufacturing took off across the state and eventually across the country. Farms saw greater increases in production with the invention of new machinery and the adoption of increased specialization. We built the Mackinac Bridge, connecting our two beautiful peninsulas, an engineering marvel that remains one of the largest suspension bridges in the world. And of course, Motown Records and all the wonderful musicians who have come since then. They gave the world some of the most, and I would say the most, wonderful music and the best musicians that have ever lived. The last few years have been tough on all of us in Michigan, but we've been through tough times before, and every time we have come back stronger than ever. We may be 175 years old, but you wouldn't know it. Our economy is growing stronger and more nimble than ever. Great sacrifices have got us to this point as we've moved through great recessions and changes in a global economy. But I'm very, very proud of everyone in Michigan that is working hard and bringing things back. Our auto companies have made an incredible comeback. GM is once again the world's largest automaker. Ford is investing billions of dollars in Michigan plants. And Chrysler is reminding the country that the very best cars and trucks are imported from Detroit. And I am so grateful for all of the sacrifice and hard work of our workers that have helped get our companies to this point. It was great to hear President Obama talk so much about the future of Michigan's economy in his State of the Union speech. We're diversifying to support new technologies and new businesses. The President invited a Michigan worker, Brian Ritterby, who lost his job in the furniture business at age 55 and was able to get retrained and have a new job at a wind turbine factory on the west side of the state. He said, "I'm proud to be working in the industry of the future." And that came because of a concerted effort of all of us working together, not only to help General Motors and Chrysler, but to focus on a manufacturing strategy of the future to make things in America. The President talked about our leadership in clean energy manufacturing and advanced battery technology. In fact, Michigan is now #1 in new clean energy patents. We're doing so much in innovation, in fact, that the U.S. Patent and Trade Office is opening a new office in Detroit in July, the first satellite office in the country. And I'm proud to have authored the provision to name it the Elijah McCoy Patent Office after an African-American inventor whose high-quality products and innovations gave rise to the expression, "Is that the real McCoy?" On Michigan's 175th anniversary, there are so many reasons I'm proud to represent our beautiful Great Lakes state. From our incredible waters to our tradition of manufacturing to our great diversity in agriculture. We make things and grow things in Michigan. We don't have a middle class in this country. We don't have an economy unless we do just that. And Michigan is once again leading the way. But I'm most honored to serve the great people of Michigan who are, without a doubt, the toughest, the friendliest, the hardest working people in the country. The author John Steinbeck once wrote of a trip that he took to Michigan. He said, "It seemed to me that the earth was generous and outgoing here in the heartland. And perhaps its people took a cue from it. And in fact, our people have. So today, as we celebrate Michigan's 175th birthday, we have an incredible history to be proud of, an incredible future to look forward to. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, representing a state that is coming up on our 350th anniversary, I'm delighted to salute the great state of Michigan on its 175th anniversary. I rise today to note the anniversary of an unfortunate event that is undermining the very core of our cherished democracy. This past Saturday marked the 2-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's disastrous 5-4 decision in a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. With that feat of judicial activism, the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court gnawed a hole in the dike protecting our elections' integrity, overturned the will of Congress and the American people, and allowed unlimited, anonymous, corporate money to flood into our elections. Senator McCain recently called this, quote, one of the worst decisions in history. Senator Schumer said at the time, quote, one thing is clear, the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court has predetermined the outcome of the next election. The winners will be the corporations. It's no secret around here that big corporate interests long have had oversized influence in the legislative and executive branches. But Citizens United supersizes that influence so that it threatens to overrun our elections. Here's how my home state newspaper, the Providence Journal, explained it. The ruling will mean that more than ever, big spending economic interests will determine who gets elected. More money will especially pour into relentless attack campaigns. Free speech for most individuals will suffer because their voices will count for even less than they do now. They will simply be drowned out by the big money. This election year already confirms those fears. Senator McCain noted earlier this month, I'll quote him again, I predicted when the United States Supreme Court, with their absolute ignorance of what happens in politics, struck down the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, that there would be a flood of money into campaigns, not transparent, unaccounted for, and this is exactly what is happening. And I predict that in the future there will be scandals because there is too much money washing around political campaigns now that nobody knows where it came from and nobody knows where it's going. Senator McCain got it right. Look at Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. This election cycle has been the coming out party for the super PACs, the so-called evil twins of candidates' campaigns. Why evil twins? Because unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can accept unlimited corporate cash. Unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can hide the identities of who's funding them until long after the voting is over. And unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can run vicious and misleading advertisements without anyone being accountable to the voters. Super PACs supposedly can't coordinate their activities with the candidates' campaigns. But we all know this is pure fiction. In practice, they're run by close confederates of the candidates, fueled by the same donors, and acting in perfect harmony with the campaigns. And it's out of control. Through the date of the New Hampshire primary, super PACs backing the Republican presidential candidates spent over $14 million, far more than the candidates' campaigns did themselves. Here's the problem. Corporations are not people. By refusing to acknowledge this, the Citizens United opinion has undermined the integrity of our democracy, allowing unlimited corporate money to drown out ordinary citizens' voices. And this isn't some unfortunate side effect of a long-standing right enshrined in our Constitution. This is new and this is novel. The founders certainly did not consider corporations to be citizens of our democracy. Corporations are not even mentioned in the Constitution once. Indeed, private business corporations were actually rare at our nation's founding. As Justice Stevens noted in his dissent in Citizens United, it is implausible that the framers believed the freedom of speech would extend equally to all corporate speakers, much less that it would preclude legislatures from taking limited measures to guard against corporate capture of elections. So there is really no case to support the Citizens United decision if you're an originalist. Federal laws have restricted corporate spending on campaigns since 1907. The principle that an inanimate business corporation is not allowed to spend unlimited dollars to influence political campaigns is a long-established cornerstone of our political system, from Teddy Roosevelt a century ago to Senators McCain and Feingold in our time, who won that bruising legislative battle for the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Citizens United overturned not just all that legislation, but also overturned a long line of judicial decisions upholding those restrictions on corporate cash in elections. So there's no case here based on precedent either. Justice Stevens noted that, and I'll quote him again, "The only relevant thing that has changed since those prior precedents that were overruled is the composition of this court." End quote. The conservatives got a majority of 5, and they ran with it. Judicial activism, pure, plain, and simple. The activism appears pretty nakedly in the majority's findings of fact. Just for starters, a Supreme Court is not supposed to make findings of fact. Its role is to review the factual record presented to it and interpret the law. But the Supreme Court's conservative bloc nevertheless made findings of fact in Citizens United. Here's one. We now conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. They just declared that to be true. Really? So a company comes in, drops a couple of $1 million to smear one candidate on behalf of the other in a closely contested race, tips the election, and you don't think that that other candidate they helped is in that company's pocket? Please. And say a year later, that company comes back and it sits down quietly with the congressman and it says, "You remember that ad we ran smearing your opponent last year that helped you win the election? Well, here's one we're going to run against you through a different phony shell organization unless you vote with us on this bill." No possibility of corruption or the appearance of corruption? Please, it is ludicrous. It is patently false. Here's another finding of fact by this block of judges. The appearance of influence or access, furthermore, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. If all you're doing is listening to the corporations, people are going to be fine with that. Please, anyone in politics knows how phony that statement is. There are hundreds of thousands of pages of findings to the contrary in the records of the previous Supreme Court decisions that were overturned and from legislative hearings. Here's what the Senate said 100 years ago, speaking about corporate money in elections. "The evils of the use of this money in connection with political elections are so generally recognized that the committee deems it unnecessary to make any argument in favor of the general purpose of this measure. It is in the interest of good government and calculated to promote purity in the selection of public officials." This finding of the Senate was magically overturned by the Citizens United 5. Other courts are having trouble swallowing this phony fact-finding. The Montana Supreme Court recently rejected this false premise that underlies Citizens United. Here's what they said. Clearly, the impact of unlimited corporate donations creates a dominating impact on the political process and inevitably minimizes the impact of individual citizens. Now that is true. But the conservative justices comprising the Citizens United 5 had to make these unsupported findings a fact. They are the analytical linchpin of the Citizens United decision. Without the pretense that corporate money could never corrupt or appear to corrupt elections, the rest of their analysis falls to pieces, and they would never have been able to open the floodgates for the big corporations. May I have an additional 2 minutes, please?
Without objection.
So they had to make these findings, even though the findings were contrary to precedent, contrary to common sense, contrary to fact. Americans of all political stripes are disgusted by the influence of unlimited, anonymous corporate cash in our elections. Rhode Islander Charles, I'll just use his first name, in Little Compton, wrote to me, "It is wrong that someone who shouts louder or further, in this instance solely because they have more money, should drown out another person. Corporations have no problems getting their views aired." Hope Whitney in Bristol wrote to me, "Just the idea that a corporation is considered an individual in regards to politics goes against everything American to me. They have become the emperors, as they have the financial ability to be heard everywhere. I'd be willing to bet that a majority of their own employees do not agree with their political representation." As Elizabeth in Wakefield, Rhode Island wrote, "Big business should not control our elections. It is bad enough that they deeply influence our politicians through lobbyists." Madam President, Rhode Islanders, like Americans across the country, have had enough. In 2010, we came within one vote in this chamber of passing the Disclose Act, which would have at least kept the corporate cash from flooding our elections anonymously. This year, let's redouble our efforts to limit the damage done by Citizens United. We must, if we're to preserve democracy of the people, by the people, and for the people from this tide of unlimited, unaccountable, and anonymous corporate money polluting our elections. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the floor.
Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of the court. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court handed down the landmark decision, Citizens United, and with it, they gave corporations a blank check to utterly destroy our political system. I'd like to take a few minutes this afternoon to tell you about the practical impact of this decision, how it threatens our democracy, and why we need to do something about it. Let me start with the punchline. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time that corporations are guaranteed the same free speech rights as real people to influence elections. I didn't say it was a funny punchline. The court had previously held that money or campaign contributions are speech, so functionally that means that corporations are now able to spend as much money as they want whenever they want in any election in this country. Let me tell you how. You may have heard a lot about PACs. PAC is short for Political Action Committee, and it is an entity that is separate from a campaign that can run political ads on issues or support or oppose a candidate. They can also give a limited amount of money directly to campaigns. The idea behind them is that if a number of citizens share views on an issue, say the environment, they can pool their resources, make their views known, and influence an election. They can run ads to call for the election of a candidate that supports those shared beliefs. But a PAC cannot coordinate with that candidate's campaign. It's not supposed to be an extension of that campaign. Prior to Citizens United, corporations could get involved in the political process, but there were special protections in place. They couldn't use their money to make a direct contribution to a campaign, and they couldn't buy political ads to directly influence elections. Instead, they had to give money to a PAC, and how much they could give was very tightly restricted. Corporations could only use their treasury funds to pay to set up and administer a PAC and could not use any money to expressly advocate for the election or defeat of any candidate. And their executives, like all other individuals, could only write checks of up to $5,000 to these PACs. Citizens United began the process of unraveling these protections when it found that companies could give unlimited money to PACs for the purposes of running ads directly advocating for or against a candidate. This kind of activity is called independent expenditures. There is one line from the Supreme Court's opinion that I think is worth sharing with you, as Senator Whitehouse did as well, because it highlights for me and for him just how absurd the thinking of the court was on this case. It said, quote, "Independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption," unquote. My emphasis added. This one line that is so flawed and so out of touch with reality is what has spawned the complete unraveling of our campaign finance system, and it has opened the floodgates for political spending. A subsequent case, freespeechnow.org v. FEC, continued what Citizens United started by finding that the contribution caps, the limits on what corporations and wealthy individuals can give to PACs, found them to be unconstitutional. The combination of these two court cases is what gave rise to what is now known as a super PAC. As a result, many regular PACs have now given way to these super PACs. Now, what does this mean in practice? It means that corporations can now give an unlimited amount of funds directly from their general treasuries to PACs, and that those funds could be used to run ads supporting a candidate or running attack ads against their opponents. And because the cap on contributions to PACs was eliminated for individuals as well, now CEOs and other super wealthy individuals can write multi-million-dollar checks to influence elections. This entirely undermines the restrictions that were put in place on how much an individual or corporation can give to a candidate running for office. You just give however much you want to the candidate's super PAC, and they buy ads that support the candidate's election, or what we've seen a lot of lately, they run negative ads that smear another candidate. A super PAC is not a new legal entity. It's just a PAC that started to bundle together these unlimited corporate donations with unlimited donations from super rich individuals with the goal of supporting or defeating certain candidates. Now, let's be clear. These super PACs aren't about issues. They're about campaigning for candidates, even though they ostensibly can't coordinate with the official campaign. And legally, a candidate can't even force them to stop. And so, many people have noted in this new political reality, it would be unilateral disarmament and ultimately electoral defeat for elected officials to run away from super PACs. That's why the system needs to be changed. But it gets even worse. In a post-Citizens United world, you often can't even find out where the money is coming from. PACs and super PACs have to disclose several times a year where they get their money from, but companies often don't want you to know that they're giving lots of money to elect or defeat someone, so they do something that looks like money laundering, except that it's legal. They might create and give money to a shell corporation, which in turn donates to a super PAC. When you look at the records for the super PAC, which are published only about quarterly, you'll see the shell corporation, but not the original source of the money. A company might give money to one shell corporation, which in turn could give money to another PAC and so on until it finally reaches the ultimate super PAC. And with records published so infrequently, it's nearly impossible to trace back to the original corporation. And to make matters even worse, many super PACs have been able to get permission from the Federal Election Commission to delay their disclosure statements, rendering all of these supposed disclosures completely useless. So back to the punchline. Corporations can now spend an unlimited sum of money to buy elections, and the American people generally won't even know about it. Corporations and super wealthy individuals no longer have to play by any sensible rules when it comes to the checks they write for campaigns. Citizens United ushered in the wild, wild west of political spending. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at some of the numbers. In the 2010 election, outside groups spent over $280 million on political ads and other campaign expenses. This is more than double the amount spent by outside groups in 2008 before the decision, and it's more than 5 times the amount spent by these groups in 2006. The Chamber of Commerce alone spent more than $32 million on campaigns in 2010, which is more than any other single outside group, and it's nearly double the amount it spent in 2008. Outside groups spent more on political advertising in 2010 than the official Democratic and Republican Party committees. But that was 2010, when corporations and the super wealthy were just beginning to understand the utility of this amazingly misguided decision. The last several months have given us example after example of what big money can do to control the political process. Now, I may not agree with the views of all of the Republican primary candidates, or any of them, for that matter. Some of their views, maybe, but not as a whole. But I do believe that everyone deserves a fair shake when they run for office, and a fair election is just not possible when corporations and wealthy individuals can swoop in and drown out the voices of hundreds of thousands of Americans with a single fat check. Madam President, may I have a few more minutes, 5 more minutes, 4 more minutes?
Is there any objection? Without objection.
Thank you. Former Speaker Newt Gingrich pulled off a surprise win in South Carolina, but I would venture to guess that it wouldn't have happened if Mr. Gingrich's super PAC hadn't received a $5 million check from one guy, a multi-billionaire from Las Vegas. This super PAC, also known as the group Winning Our Future, used the money to pay for attack ads against former Governor Mitt Romney. And just a few days ago, it was announced that the wife of the same billionaire wrote another $5 million check to Mr. Gingrich's super PAC to help him out in Florida. Now, I wish I could offer an example of a company writing a similar check, but as I mentioned before, there's just no way of knowing if they did or didn't, because they don't have to disclose it, and they can take steps to hide it. But this example of 2 $5 million checks from one couple who just happened to be willing to talk about their donations should show just how big we're talking. This is very, very big money, and it is happening now. To be fair, Mr. Romney has his own super PAC called Restore Our Future, and it is currently outspending every other PAC in Florida by 20-1. I wish I could tell you how this is possible, but the first disclosure statement for this campaign season isn't out until the end of this month. And even then, it'll be hard to trace back to individual companies or people through all the shell corporations and other PACs. And this is only the beginning. Hold on to your hats. Over the next 10 months, I predict we will not just see a flood, but we will see a tidal wave of political spending by corporations and the wealthiest of the wealthiest Americans, the vast majority of whom are also running these corporations. Now, what will this mean? It means it will be hard for $25 individual contributions to make any impact when compared to a single $5 million check from a super wealthy and super self-interested individual. Your voice and the voice of millions of Americans like you will be overwhelmed by the voice of a corporation or uber-wealthy individual that can write multi-million-dollar checks without blinking an eye. All of this is going to happen under a shroud of secrecy. We may not know who is bankrolling these groups, but we do know who is hurt by them. And it is all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike. And no matter where your ideology falls or what political party you associate with, I think you should agree with me that this process just isn't fair. This isn't right, and it is something that we need to change. Congress tried to do something about this a little over a year ago when we took up Chuck Schumer's Disclose Act. Despite overwhelming public support for disclosure laws, this tremendous piece of legislation did not pass. It failed the Senate by one vote. I'm sad to say that every Democrat voted for it and every Republican voted against it. That's a very disappointing outcome because this is an issue that affects candidates of both parties. It's one we should all be able to get behind. We are all hurt by corporations that can write enormous checks to their favorite politician, and we are all hurt when wealthy individuals can shield their contributions from the public by donating to shell groups and phony organizations that do nothing but pass those dollars on to help the candidate of their choice. This is a matter of transparency and accountability and fairness, which should cut across the entire political spectrum. Although we may not agree on everything, I do think we can all agree that we need to do more to bring greater transparency to the election process. A number of my Republican colleagues agree with me and had agreed for years before the Supreme Court further unraveled restrictions on corporate spending. I'll read one of the quotes. A good friend of mine, Senator Jeff Sessions, has said, quote, "I don't like it when a large source of money is out there funding ads and is unaccountable. To the extent we can, I tend to favor disclosure," unquote. I could go for minute upon minute upon minute reading these quotes. I won't, in interest of time. So this is a problem that we all need to recognize, we all need to deal with. Republican presidential candidates are dealing with it now, but soon it will be the Democrats' turn. So I've teamed up with a number of my colleagues, many of whom will be speaking today, to see that Congress can take up legislation where we disclose, where we have greater transparency for this out-of-control spending. We're going to work hard to bring our Republican colleagues to the table and get their agreement on a path forward. Disclosure will not fix all the evils of Citizens United, but it certainly be a step forward. I hope my colleagues will join with us in this effort, and I hope to be back on the floor many times. I know I thank you for your indulgence, Madam President, because I know that I've run out of time, and I thank you, and I yield the floor.
The Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President, and I want to thank the Senator from Minnesota. As he was eloquently telling us, last Saturday was the 2-year anniversary of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that caused our democracy to take a giant step back from the values that we hold dear in this country. It was a ruling that overturned decades of campaign finance law and policy, allowed corporations and special interest groups to spend unlimited amounts of their money influencing our democracy, and blew the door wide open for foreign corporations to spend their money on elections right here in the United States. Madam President, that disastrous decision opened up loopholes in our campaign finance laws big enough for the biggest corporations and wealthiest Americans to drive truckloads of anonymous money right through. And as we have seen over the last 2 years, that is exactly what they have done. Tens of millions of dollars have flooded our electoral process. No transparency, no accountability, no way for the American people to know where it's coming from or who would benefit from the policies being advocated for. Madam President, this is wrong. It's not the way elections in America are supposed to work. We are a country that believes very strongly that every voice deserves to be heard. If you have a good idea, you can go out and talk about it. If your fellow citizens agree with you, they can stand with you. They can tell their friends and their neighbors and vote for you or in support of the issue. That's one of the foundations of our great democracy. Today, it's being subverted. The Citizens United ruling has given special interest groups and the wealthiest Americans a giant megaphone to drown out the voices of ordinary citizens across America, to spend unlimited money and do it with no transparency, no accountability. Madam President, this is a personal issue for me. When I first ran for the Senate back in 1992, I was a long-shot candidate with some ideas and a group of amazing and passionate volunteers by my side. Those volunteers cared deeply about making sure the voices of average Washington State families were being represented. They made phone calls, they went door to door, they talked to families across my state who wanted more from their government. Well, we ended up winning that grassroots campaign because the people's voices were heard loud and clear. But to be honest, I don't think it would have been possible if corporations and special interests had been able to drown out their voices with a barrage of anonymous negative ads. Now, Madam President, my story is not unique. In every election across the country, ordinary citizens make the decision to get involved in the political process. They lace up their shoes and hit the streets and make the case to their fellow citizens. They ask their friends and their neighbors for financial support to help them spread their ideas. And they publicly release the names and contributions of everyone who supports their campaign. These men and women come from all different walks of life, and they each have their own reasons for running. But for the most of our nation's history, they had a shot. They could compete. Ordinary Americans who wanted to get involved in public service to improve their community or their state or their nation, they could do that because their voice could be heard. But, Madam President, if Citizens United is allowed to stand, these Americans are going to be drowned out and beaten down by the onslaught of unlimited and anonymous money special interests can throw into races to support the candidates who agree with them, the candidates who will be good for their bottom line and who won't threaten the loopholes and subsidies or tax breaks that their financial backers profit from. This is wrong. It needs to end. Last session, I was proud to support legislation, the Disclose Act, that would shine a bright spotlight on this process and force special interest groups and CEOs to take responsibility for the ads they put on the airwaves, the same way candidates do. That bill would have strengthened overall disclosure requirements for groups who are attempting to sway our elections. It would have banned foreign corporations and special interest groups from spending in U.S. elections, made sure corporations are not hiding their election spending from their shareholders, limited election spending by government contractors to make sure taxpayer funding is never used to influence an election, and would have banned coordination between candidates and outside groups on advertising so corporations and special interest groups can never sponsor a candidate. Madam President, that bill was blocked here on the Senate floor last session, but we cannot give up. We need to overturn Citizens United and hand our democracy back to our citizens. Anyone who believes special interest groups and big corporations shouldn't be able to spend unlimited money influencing our elections without any accountability or any transparency should support this effort. Anyone who believes that foreign entities should have no right to influence U.S. elections should stand by our side. And anyone who agrees with Justice Brandeis that sunlight is the best disinfectant should drop their opposition to this and work with us to get this done. Madam President, throughout the history of our great nation, ordinary citizens have had a strong voice in our electoral process. The Citizens United decision is a threat to that critical foundation of our democracy. And 2 years later, it's clearer than ever we cannot allow it to stand. So I thank all of our colleagues who are speaking out here on this floor and vow to continue to work with us to right this wrong. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I am proud to follow the distinguished senator from the state of Washington who has spoken so powerfully on this issue, which is especially appropriate at this time because we do mark the 2-year anniversary of the United States Supreme Court's momentous and misguided decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. That decision strikes at the core of democratic ideals and principles, not just because it opens the floodgates for money that can drown out the voices of millions of ordinary Americans in the political process, but also demonstrates the results of judicial activism at its worst. In that case, the court, by a 5-4 margin, held that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend unlimited amounts of money in the service of political candidates, and that those rights can't be abridged by placing limits on their independent spending for political purposes. This decision not only expanded the ability of wealthy individuals and large corporations to flood out the voices of millions of ordinary Americans, it also reversed nearly a century of existing law and struck down a validly approved by this Congress, validly approved bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, approved in 2002. The purpose of that act was to limit the corrosive influence of money on our political process that has been discussed and denounced by members of this body again and again and again, and by the President of the United States as recently as a couple of nights ago. This decision, in my view, was wrong as a matter of law as well as policy. It enables unlimited anonymous money to be contributed in support or opposition to candidates. It allows the wealthy and powerful to have a disproportionate voice in the most important and fundamental aspect of our democracy, a free and fair election that counts everyone's vote equally. The shockwaves of that decision in Citizens United are reverberating now with increasing impact throughout our political system. We can see them every day, literally, in the ads that appear on TV in major markets, in the primary states and throughout the country, that could and might as well be in the voices of the candidates themselves. Outside groups spent 4 times as much money in the 2010 midterms as in the 2006 midterms, nearly $300 million. Nearly half of the money spent in the 2010 elections was spent by just 10 groups. Outside spending per race tilted in favor of the winning candidate in 60 of the 75 contests last year where power changed hands. This impact is visible and tangible, undeniable in our political process. It is right before us, as visible as the deaths and people in this chamber. And that impact can be expected to grow dramatically in 2012, as spending in the presidential years is typically much higher than in the midterm elections. According to OpenSecrets.org, which tracks political spending, as of today, 296 groups organized as super PACs have already reported spending nearly $41 million on the upcoming election. These super PACs are banned from explicitly coordinating with the candidate they support, but they are operated and controlled by supporters, many of them former staff members. Their collaboration and confederacy are no less impact because of that rule barring explicit coordination. We must act to limit the destructive effects of Citizens United before it permanently alters the nature of our political system, undermining it forever and eviscerating the fundamental rights and freedoms that are protected by our Constitution. I'm a strong proponent of legislative proposals to force corporations and individuals to disclose their enormous donations and expenditures to the public. A number of them have been mentioned by my colleagues, and I support them. The Supreme Court's opinion in Citizens United naively argued that voters could readily learn the identities of companies behind these corporate-funded political advertisements. But the fact of the matter is otherwise. Nearly half of the $300 million spent by outside groups in 2006 came from groups that did not disclose their funding sources. We must pass disclosure legislation immediately to at least allow sunshine to rein in the worst excesses of this new system, to give ordinary Americans the knowledge they need so that disclosure protects their freedom. But I also believe that we need to go further. And that's why I'm a co-sponsor of the constitutional amendment that would reverse this decision. The amendment, Senate Joint Resolution 29, would reiterate what we all believe the law to be before Citizens United. That resolution clarifies, and the amendment would do so, that Congress does indeed have the power, and I quote, to regulate the raising and spending of money and in-kind equivalents with respect to federal elections. And that states have the authority with regard to state elections to do the same. I know that amending the Constitution isn't easy, and supporting a proposed amendment is not something I do lightly. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court has clearly demonstrated that it will permit unchecked corporate power over elections, and the task is then for Congress and the states and the people to restrain such spending and thereby rein in the Supreme Court. Many have seen Citizens United as an expression of the United States Supreme Court's judicial activism in favor of well-funded and well-lawyered corporations, often at the expense of vulnerable Americans, and there is support for that view of the Supreme Court's trend in decisions. In AT&T versus Concepcion, it expanded the ability of companies to force consumers into secretive, binding arbitration agreements. In Walmart v. Dukes, it restricted the ability of similarly situated persons, including female employees who face discrimination in the workplace, to band together and seek redress against a powerful company. In Pliva versus Mensing, a case involving a woman who sustained injuries from a drug company's failure to properly disclose the risks of a generic drug, the court sided with the drug company, holding that a generic drug company is not liable under state law for failing to notify the FDA or the consumer about newly discovered risks of the drug. In Sorrell v. IMS Health, the court overturned a Vermont law intended to prevent improper and invasive practices of drug companies tracking doctors' prescriptions to patients. And just 2 weeks ago, in CompuCredit v. Greenwood, the court halted a class action lawsuit by consumers who signed up for a credit card marketed to individuals with poor credit histories. Each of these decisions and others has been interpreted as part of a pattern that led the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold a hearing a few months ago entitled Barriers to Justice and Accountability: How the Supreme Court Recent Rulings Will Affect corporate behavior. But more important than that perception and the appearance of that favoritism in judicial activism is the activism itself, the potential overreaching that undermines the faith and confidence in people in the courts. And Citizens United exemplifies judicial activism at its worst. People want limits on the corrosive and corrupting influence of money. They want restraints on the power of